Right, a few words of introduction. PhD in 2017 on the subject of the farming community in Lower Wharfdale in Yorkshire between 1940 and 1951. You've used a lot of oral history in this, and there's a book on the way. You're currently working as a postdoctoral research associate on the AHRC funded project Past Flooding Matters at Hull. So tell us about reconciling community and competition in livestock farming from 1962, which I don't remember, through to the present day, which I do.
Right, but I shall endeavour to do so. So neighbourliness is not perhaps a term that one readily associates with modern farming in Britain. Many of the changes which have occurred in the period since the introduction of the Common Agricultural Policy in 1962 have had the effect of increasing competition between farmers, but there still remains evidence of a continuing neighbourliness between farming people, which has come to light primarily through oral history interviews. I'm going to discuss a few ideas and thoughts about how the balance between community and competition has developed since 1962. And I'm going to be referring frequently to the concept of crisis at different levels. The photo, which is going to serve as a background for most of this presentation, shows a farmer who is actually my dad in the early 1980s in a situation which might be described as a farm level crisis. At this level, the solution might be for him to call in a favour from a neighbour, perhaps drawing on networks of reciprocal aid by calling somebody who'd received a good turn from him 20 to 30 years earlier. This timeline shows some of the key points and key changes for livestock farmers in Britain during the later 20th and early 21st centuries. The period since the introduction of the Common Agricultural Policy has been characterised by increasing concern about livestock disease, most troublingly tuberculosis, BSE and foot and mouth disease. Transporting large numbers of animals between locations has been made more efficient by the increasing size and speed of suitable vehicles and the extension of road networks, which makes the spread of disease likewise more efficient. This period has also been characterised by a slew of legislation generally targeted towards intensifying and controlling agriculture, and this has changed the face of farming communities and farms themselves. Farm amalgamations, encouraged by government schemes, have removed many smaller farms, reducing overall numbers and increasing the value of farms available to rent. Single farm payments, which used to be paid out on livestock units but are now paid on acreages, price guarantees and the removal of marketing boards have had the effect of encouraging increasing livestock numbers and competition between neighbouring farmers. This has benefited the national commercial herd, fostering breed improvement, but has also had the effect of reducing numbers of rarer breeds and forcing smaller farmers to expand or to go out of business. Alongside the growth of competition, the closure of smaller, less competitive abattoirs and traditional community social centres in the form of auction marts has created a crisis in slow motion, whereby the means of social engagement and farmer input into maintaining fair prices for livestock are rapidly depleted. I'm not going to read out the full timeline because we'll be here all day. So I'm going to use the community of Lower Wharfdale, which is just north of Leeds in Yorkshire, to look at how neighbourliness and competition balance in the interactions between farmers since 1962. This is an area characterised by small tenanted farms and mixed agriculture. In this context, the auction mart, where livestock is bought and sold, forms a microcosm of larger patterns of community and competition. So I'm going to start here. This slide shows the Bridge End auction mart at Otley in Lower Wharfdale. In the early 1960s, you can see the little shorthorn cow in the ring there and the crowd of buyers sitting down actually inside the ring. Contrast that with the Wharfdale Farmers Auction Mart in 2019. This is also at Otley. In the intervening years, the size and development of mature cattle has increased enormously, and the safety measures at the auction mart have grown in proportion to the increased risk these larger animals pose. As farm amalgamations take place and single farm payments were made on the basis of livestock units, herds grew and animals were handled far less than their smaller predecessors. This consequence of increasing competition is reflected in the higher ring fences, the removal of buyers from the ring, and sophisticated handling equipment. You can see the barrier, which is just visible on the far right, and the drop gate on the back wall. Increased competition is therefore quite literally changing the landscape of British farming. So I'm going to play a very short film now to hopefully perk everybody up at this late stage of the afternoon. So it's important to note from this video the number of older people sitting around the ring. Most people here will stand or sit in the exact same place every single time they come, so everybody will know if somebody's missing. It's also quite a transparent process. Everyone can see clearly what's for sale. They've had a chance to inspect it beforehand. Everybody knows who's bought what, who's selling what, and who's bid on what. So the pricing is quite transparent. There we go. The auction mart's important for two reasons. It's valuable to farmers as a means of setting a baseline for prices. The price that buyers are willing to pay in the auction mart directly informs the deadweight price farmers are able to get from meat buyers. By selling animals through the public auction, farmers have been able to work together to keep pricing transparent, benefiting the community as a whole. Marts also serve as a locus for social interaction between farmers who may be working alone for much of their time. The social aspect is crucial. By getting to know fellow auction goers, farmers are able to plan and moderate their bidding behaviour with long-term relationships in mind. As one farmer confided to me, the art of the job, as he called it, is in knowing what others are looking for and sometimes allowing them to have it in the hope that they may do the same for you on another occasion. Another important aspect in an increasingly ageing agricultural population is that it allows neighbours to keep an eye on elderly community members. Through oral history interviewing, I've become aware of cases in which farmers have taken on voluntary work on neighbours' farms to help families through the illness or death of an elderly farmer. So feeding animals, even carving cows that need to be carved. Animal care work doesn't cease simply because the only person running the farm has died. It takes time to organise a dispersal sale, especially at a time of family-level crisis. And this is where neighbouring farmers might step in. There's a sense among farmers that I spoke to that this is just simply what you do if you have the knowledge to care for the animals correctly, as not everyone does. And those who fail to step in or who do so in a slapdash fashion and let things slide are remembered and gossiped about and judged. So in this context, the rapid decline of auction marts shown on this graph can be characterised as a crisis in slow motion, both in terms of social support for the community and the economic viability of small-scale livestock enterprises. This decline has been matched by closures of small local abattoirs, increasingly leaving meat pricing in the hands of very large conglomerates and supermarkets, in whose interests it is to drive prices downward. Mart closures reduce opportunities for local farmers to socialise and to check up on older neighbours. As numbers of sales venues and slaughterhouses decrease, so the distances that animals need to be transported for sale or slaughter become greater. Government encouragement for farm amalgamation also means that larger numbers of animals are being transported around Britain than ever before. So animal disease has played an important role in shifting relationships between neighbours, since at least closures reduce opportunities for local farmers to socialise and to check up on neighbours. As numbers of sales venues and slaughterhouses decrease, so the distances that animals need to be transported for sale or slaughter become greater. Government encouragement for farm amalgamation also means that larger numbers of animals are being transported around Britain than ever before. Animal disease has played an important role in shifting relationships between neighbours since at least the 19th century. The three main animal diseases, which I'm going to talk about today, that have influenced neighbourliness among British farmers since 1962 are bovine tuberculosis. Unfortunately, from the mid-1980s, Incidences of TB began to rise again, prompting the questions about the impact of TB in the wild badger population, which continue today. Where this disease history intersects with ideas about neighbourliness is in the intervals between testing. Testing costs both money and time, as well as limiting buyers for livestock. A farmer in a 4-year testing area is likely to think twice before buying an animal from a 1-year testing zone over a similar beast from a clean area. As farms have amalgamated and become larger, some farmers have been able to build businesses by taking higher risks, bringing stock in from longer distances away, and perhaps buying sight unseen through dealers. These farmers have been bitterly complained about, as we can see in the quote here, by smaller neighbours, particularly in relation to TB, as they see a potential move to a shorter TB testing interval damaging their businesses. This resentment creates rifts within communities, gradually contributing to the erosion of neighbourliness over time as the offence is repeated. The BSE crisis in the 1990s, during which links were made between infected beef and new variant CJD in humans, arguably recreated this pattern of local neighbourly distrust across international boundaries. Exports of British beef were banned worldwide in March 1996. Restrictions were eased to allow exports of boneless beef and beef products from animals aged under 30 months in 1999, but the bans remained in the key markets of France and Germany, which did not believe in the safety of British beef. Conservative leader William Hague described this move as giving the 2 fingers to Britain. NFU President Ben Gill's comment echoed the localised resentment and sense of unfairness seen in the case of TB testing. British farmers have waited 3.5 years, the vast bulk of that without any proper justification, to have this ban lifted, he said. The ban wasn't actually fully lifted until 2006. The biggest agricultural crisis of the 21st century was arguably foot and mouth disease in 2001. The disease spreads incredibly quickly, with more severe effects among intensively reared animals than among traditional breeds. Legislation requiring same-day slaughter for all infected cattle had been put in place following a small outbreak in 1967. By 2001, policies managed by the EU prescribed immediate culling of infected livestock and of animals on farms adjacent to infected farms, and the immediate burning of carcasses on farm. The impact on agriculture as an industry was enormous, as all livestock movements ceased. No animals could be sold, but of course all still had to be housed, fed and watered, throwing farmers' business plans into disarray. The social cost was also extremely high. This quote on the slide from a farmer in Lower Wharfdale highlights the fear experienced by those who had dedicated their lives to improving their herds. Due to the legislative events I talked about earlier, commercial herds had grown in value since the 1967 outbreak. As expansion, amalgamation and improvement had been encouraged, continental blood had been brought into the national commercial herd, creating larger, more intensively bred cattle. These animals are not simply business assets, particularly for small-scale farmers. They're a source of personal pride, and a good bloodline can form a legacy to be passed to the next generation. In this context, many farmers, like the one mentioned here, chose to isolate completely, cutting themselves off from neighbours, family and friends in an effort to keep their animals safe, with a consequent severe impact on mental health within the farming community. Since 2001, mental health has become a hot topic in farming and has been linked to rural isolation caused by the closure of community centres like the auction marts, the reduction of numbers of people on farm, conditions like PTSD caused by working in one of the most dangerous industries in the UK today, and to a blurring between work and home life in a farm environment, which increases stress levels. The common thread between TB and foot and mouth in terms of social consequences has been an increase of distrust between neighbours and the isolation of farmers on farms, which have grown larger and seen staff decreases as a result of legislative and technological progress since the introduction of the cap in 1962. One interviewee pointed to the long-term dual impact of foot and mouth on the auction marts, which, as we've already seen, are the locus of social interaction within livestock farming circles, as well as a means for maintaining fair prices. This dual impact is a long-term crisis not only for farm businesses, but also for the mental health of farmers, reducing opportunities for social and leisure time, and the chances to talk to neighbours who are experiencing the same stressful issues at the same time. Instances of disease, TB, foot and mouth, and BSE are national and international level crises, which have damaged feelings of local neighbourliness by exacerbating distrust within the modern farming community at a local, regional, and international scale. A 2005 study on the social effects of foot and mouth concluded that life after the foot and mouth disease epidemic has been accompanied by distress, feelings of bereavement, fear of a new disaster, loss of trust in authority and systems of control, and by the undermining of the value of local knowledge. But this isn't the end of the story. While the march of technological innovation has reduced the need for large numbers of farm workers, technology has also begun to facilitate farming community interactions and neighbourly behaviour between individuals and farming groups across wider areas than have previously been possible. Social media is used by individuals to connect with community members they may not see on a day-to-day basis. It enables people to spread news of local criminal activity and to ask for help, for example, with escaped or injured stock. It allows them to advertise stock coming up for sale or encourage people to attend farm sales and auction mart events. The farming community responds to requests for help, building on networks of reciprocal aid, farmers helping neighbouring farmers, which still exist despite the damage done to them by increasing competition and resentment, and decreasing opportunities to socialise between farmers. This technology can also be used to access a wider bank of farming knowledge through, for example, Facebook groups and online farming forums. In 1962, many farmers still attended pubs after sales, with one interviewee describing how you could learn more in an afternoon in the pub than you would in a week on the farm. In 2020, this knowledge exchange takes place online. In recent years, grassroots activities such as tractor aid and forage aid, through which farmers have delivered feed and straw to others affected by flooding, heavy snows, and other similar crises, have been organised using social media. This has taken place locally and over long distances. The first tractor aid run, for example, was a 225-mile trip from Wakefield to flooded farms in Somerset, which is no mean feat in a tractor with a fully loaded trailer. Younger farmers are increasingly turning to social media to take the place of face-to-face information sharing. While they're keenly aware of the issues of privacy and unchecked information around the use of social media, it's generally welcomed as a good thing, with those at the higher end of the younger age group, so around their 40s, confidently predicting that future generations will make even greater use of the technology. It's worth noticing that it also fills another gap left by the decline in face-to-face neighbourly relations, the chance to observe what neighbours are up to and to gossip about it. Of course, we're currently in the middle of another crisis, one which is far bigger than those I discussed earlier. I think the way that this has affected livestock farming brings together all of the threads which have been picked up in this paper. On the slide is a statement from the Executive Director of the Institute of Auctioneers and Valuers of Scotland. Through the second lockdown, English marts have been following the measures put in place earlier by Scotland, in which serious buyers must register and book a place at an auction. Sellers must follow a drop and go policy when delivering livestock and can't wait to see their stock sold. These measures are obviously necessary in a community in which the average age is 59, but they exacerbate existing isolation for older community members who are not as au fait with social media as the younger generation. To conclude, neighbourliness in agriculture since the implementation of the Common Agricultural Policy in 1962 can be seen through the lens of successive crises, from international level in the case of disease outbreaks down to personal level in the case of poor mental health and bereavement. While legislation, business pressures and disease have pushed neighbouring farmers apart, younger generations of farmers have found new ways to communicate. Facilitated by social media, neighbourly behaviour between farmers is increasingly being practised across larger populations and longer distances. Thank you, and apologies for the technical issues.
Jane, thank you very much indeed. That was a question.
So
Paul,
If I can come in, it's not a question, it was just an observation that I put in chat about, I think that's just a tremendously important point you made about, neighbours assisting each other, but also observing each other's work and how that changes with farm size and machinery. And I can think of lots of authors who talked about that previously, including some from the 30s, about how it put pressure to keep the quality up and pride that was important in it, but also helping. I mean, it's just such an important point. It's a great one.
Absolutely. I think a particular instance I had in mind was when I finally persuaded my father to let me drive the combine, and he made me wait until he was ready to combine a field that nobody could see from any footpaths or roads. And it was, my result was, as expected, absolutely dreadful. And that's why he kept it hidden from everyone else.
As I don't think we have any questions at the moment, I think you make a very interesting case for the role of disease as a shock which brings about big change in farming societies. And we know about foot and mouth because that's in our own time. I think what is very interesting is that you have some very pertinent examples of earlier changes which were equally important in the way in which they brought about big changes in farming communities. Perhaps not transformations, but certainly big alterations in practice.
Yes, I think it's a thread which keeps running through farming. I mean, my particular area is largely characterised by livestock farming, and arable is on a fairly small scale. But I think certainly as soon as you start talking to people about disease, they remember who had it, when they had it. Usually they'll tell you all about it in great detail, and it's clearly a kind of festering resentment among people that they've had to go to 1-year testing instead of 4-year testing because John down the road bought some cattle from Devon that he hadn't had tested. And this kind of thing, it really builds resentment between people. And obviously people are also affected by the legislative change that comes as a result of that. So one of the big changes that's happened in the period I'm talking about is having to wait a certain period of time after bringing stock onto your farm before you can take any stock away again. And that really slows everything down and makes people quite resentful about things that disrupt that process.
I was just going to say we have a couple of points in the chat there from people about farm life balance, which Tony Pratt suggests hasn't changed much in the last 60 years, he thinks.
I tend to agree with that, yeah.
Okay. And then Heather Holmes writing that farmers have long memories about what their neighbours have been up to.
Oh yeah, definitely. I've had instances in my oral history interviews of people actually being quite personal about my own grandfather, who has been dead since 1984, because he did something that upset their grandfather, who has also been dead since the early 90s. People will be friendly to your face, but if you remind them of that thing that Grandad did, it's people still remember it, and they will still say, well, this bad thing's happened to you, but maybe it's fair because your grandfather tried to take my farm.
I was just thinking about some of the issues you were raising about the sort of social functions of markets. Obviously, you're dealing primarily with livestock farmers whose routine was, should we say, rooted in going to the market. And I was thinking actually about some of the experiences of looking at 18th century farmers where increasingly, rather than taking their corn to market, they're buying from corn dealers coming to the farm. And just thinking, well, obviously, I mean, they're still selling cattle and livestock, presumably in local markets and things, but you're thinking about some of the changing relationships that would have caused, in that period, really. So the way that those social dynamics are obviously affected by these sort of market mechanisms.
Yeah, I think the closure of the markets and use of dealers, although a lot of people I spoke to said in the past that having dealers come to the farm was a way of spreading news from farm to farm, but I think it's also missing that aspect of being able to go to the pub or to the cafe afterwards and just say, I'm having this problem. Have you had a problem like this? What did you try? What happened? I think that's a really valuable knowledge exchange process, which has been sort of lost through the closure of auction marts, but people are starting to rebuild it online now, which I think is a really interesting development.
Do we have any more questions? Does anybody want to contribute?
Yeah,
Anything?
I'd have another question if there's no one else coming in. Yeah, I mean, you were making a really compelling case, Jane, about the importance of markets, you know, both in terms of the function of markets and the economic knowledge acquired, and sociability. I wondered about other kind of emergent networks of sociability, and that, you know, many people, many couples or families on farms will have other people doing other full-time jobs or part-time jobs off farms. You know, there could be any type of works in shops or schools or things around. And I wondered whether, do those networks that might be more likely to involve women create kind of substitute networks of sociability or new networks of sociability that connect in with farming at all?
I think so in some places, yes. I think certainly in my own experience, I know a lot of women who go and then get a job on another farm. So to use my mum as an example, she works on our farm. She actually is the person who goes to the auction. And she also has a job on a neighbouring farm, which grows a lot of oilseed rape. So she will tend to, if there's news on one farm, she will take it to another one. And she's kind of working as part of a wider network of gossiping and sharing stories, sharing information, and really, yeah, a kind of substitute for the men going to the auction every week.
We have a question from Nicholas Corker. Nicholas says, great paper, there's a tension between neighbourliness and competition, managed, I guess, by cultural rules. I wonder, is this a historic dynamic for innovation, now perhaps like the marts in decline?
Thank you. I think it's difficult to say, really. Obviously, the marts are a really interesting phenomenon because actually they only appeared in the 19th century, so they've been very short-lived, really, to have such a big impact on the way that livestock's sold. I think in terms of the cultural rules being in decline, I think it's interesting to see the dynamics between smaller farmers and larger farmers and how they manage relations with the community. I think, as I said, these are some thoughts on the topic, so I'd probably like to look into that a bit more, I think, but thank you for that idea.
James Bowen, you're live, so do you want to talk?
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much for that paper. It was very interesting. Your graph showed really the dramatic decline of auction marts, which you said is mirrored in the closure of abattoirs. I wondered whether during your research you've identified a shift towards the private buying and selling of livestock. Is this an increasing trend, particularly as local markets close and farmers have to travel further to go to market? Or perhaps as buyers acting as middlemen on behalf of large supermarkets, for instance, tend to buy directly from farms, perhaps through cooperative schemes? And presumably private sales relies on mutual trust between farmers. And I wondered whether, again, the trend with social media was perhaps encouraging sort of private sales between farmers.
Yes, you do see them, and I would say they are going on fairly steadily. You get a lot of newspaper adverts, and people are using the auction marts that remain to facilitate private sales. So you would get the auctioneer's company to go out to the farm and sell in a farm dispersal sale or something of that nature. I think it does involve trust to buy from farms, particularly if you're buying sight unseen. but also the role of dealers might be to go to different auctions. You could put in essentially an order. You say, I want so many cattle of this type, and the dealer would go and source them for you. So that would necessitate having a relationship with that particular dealer. In terms of the abattoirs closing, you now get really big corporations that do the work, and I think that's another interesting development, because you don't get that relationship with the slaughterman. There's also the fact that now you have to actually pay. If an animal dies on farm, you have to pay for it to be taken away, rather than for somebody to come and essentially buy the carcass off you, which used to happen. So I think a lot of things have been changing, and it does mean that the way people relate to each other has become a little bit more commercial and a bit less based in who you know. Yeah.
And the last question I'm going to take is from Greg Bankoff, and Greg, you're live. So
yeah, thank you very much, Jen. I just wondered if you could say something about what you've been talking about is the relationship between more family-run farms and smaller farmers. And I was wondering how the sort of social community relationships worked or didn't work with sort of larger, more commercial farmers.
Yeah, well, as I say, the area that I've been looking at for this particular topic is generally characterised by smaller farms. So it's a bit difficult to say when you get past a certain point how that relationship changes. So I know for the work that I've done with Hull, obviously I'm looking at Lincolnshire, and the farmers there are much bigger, but they also tend to be more arable. So it's not quite the same relationship as going to the auction mart on a weekly basis. I think obviously as farmers get bigger, they have fewer people around than they used to have in the past, but bigger farms also do employ, for example, tractor drivers, stockmen, and for that you have a whole separate economy of the auctioneers. You get mechanics, people who are going to fix the machine. For places with the really big combines, you can get combines which will actually call somebody out from Germany in a van to come and fix your combine before it breaks, which I think is amazing. But it means that you start to build up this very spread out community of different people who are going to come onto the larger farm from further away to mend things, to fix things, to facilitate things. So it's, in a way, I suppose it's recreating a kind of village dynamic, but with a wider range of people who are experts in their own little field that can facilitate the running of the larger farm, which isn't maybe necessary on a smaller enterprise.
Jane, I'm going to thank you at this point and say that was another terrific paper, which brings us right up to date and some of the present problems faced by the farming community and the way in which they are coping with those problems and trying to use the current technologies to overcome those problems. I'm going to allow myself just one or two concluding comments at the end of this, and then we really can all be away by 6 o'clock. First of all, I want to say that this was originally Paul Ward's idea, and I think we're all entirely grateful to him for introducing neighbourliness into the rural historian's vocabulary. The problem with neighbourliness, which I find is an intriguing idea, is that it is perhaps too flexible an idea, too diffuse an idea. We've seen people pulling it in all sorts of directions during the afternoon, I think always profitably, but we've seen neighbourliness in its sort of negative sense of disputes. We've seen neighbourliness in its form of networks and connections. We've seen neighbourliness in a much more localised village sense. I think all good, but there is a danger that neighbourliness is going to become key, is that it is actually quite hard to pin down as in the historical context. That Chris Dyer uses a degree of ingenuity in getting at neighbourliness from manorial records. Heather Holmes uses a different sort of ingenuity to get at neighbourliness from what are essentially company records, from legal records. Malcolm Thick talks about neighbourliness really as the sharing of knowledge and good practice between neighbours, which in a sense is also something which Jane has told us about in the last paper of this session. I think it begs the question of how do we recover neighbourliness as rural historians? If we're talking about the recent past and we can use rural history, then we can go and talk to people. It's going to be, I think, much more difficult to recover neighbourliness from what we might call deep history, from earlier periods. Carol shows us one way in which we can do this by looking at the autobiographical and descriptive literature of the early part of the 20th century and perhaps a lot further back. But I think for a lot of us, neighbourliness is going to be something which we're going to be aware of, but it's going to be rather elusive. And I have a question in my mind as to how we relate neighbourliness to the whole idea of class in rural communities, because we know that rural communities are not invariably happy or satisfactory or holistic places. They are riddled by disputes, expectations, by different levels of wealth, different living standards, and of course by simple employment. But people may well be very neighbourly, but they are employing their neighbours as well. And therefore there are power relationships within villages that may well transcend neighbourliness. And here I was struck by Carol's comments at the end, by her very mild rebuke to me about one shouldn't assume that formal institutions of democracy actually mean that there is any form of democracy going on. So I think that it's a wonderful concept, and it's one that I shall certainly factor into my own work and be alert to and look out for. But as a historian working in earlier periods, I'm not sure whether I can really follow it a great distance, except with the most exceptional sources, one of which is the diary that I've used before by Walkden, which certainly has got a lot to say about neighbourliness. As I've just thanked Paul, and as Paul has just popped up to say that he has what he calls a wee comment, Paul, is it really a wee comment?
It is. I just want to say, you perhaps imply that actually I gave more thought to the term neighbourliness than was in fact the case in putting this together, and it was intentionally capacious. But actually what's come to me as being really significant out of all of the papers this afternoon, it's been tremendously interesting, is the value of using what you might call an anthropological eye in looking at communities. And I think that's a sensibility that even when it's difficult to get at through the records, it's important to remember, and maybe has been a bit neglected in rural history. And thinking about the shape of interaction, and I think that can come through actually really classic old themes like settlement design and field systems, but also, as you know, coming up to the present, that Jane has shown really visibly could work through the social media and all sorts of kind of, you know, commercial channels and interactions too. And I think that's something that's maybe been a bit missing in some of the more economically minded agricultural history that we've had. That's my wee comment.
I am going to claim the last word on this for myself, because I want to thank all the speakers. 6 terrific papers, 6 very different papers, 6 very rewarding papers. I want to thank all the participants, 63 of whom have survived through to the very end. So you all get a little prize for endurance. And I want to thank Catherine Glover for having masterminded the technical aspects of this. And ladies and gentlemen, we hope to see you all at future British Agricultural History Society, virtual seminars and conferences. So thank you all very much indeed.
And thank you to you and Kathy as well for hosting it so ably. So thank you very much.
A happy Christmas, everybody. And we look forward to a new year, which is a better year in every respect than 2020 has been. So goodbye.